The perspective you get when someone who doesn't get to hold the camera suddenly gets to hold the camera or, do the coding, right, is innovative because at the end of the day, that's where technology comes from. It comes from people. And if the same people are making the same technology for years and years and years, you're not really going to see anything new. But if someone else suddenly gets a hold of that computer, I think you're going to see some fresh starts.
This is Velocitize Talks, and I'm Andy North. I'm joined today by David Dillon Thomas, Principal Content Strategy at Think Company. David, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit about Think Company, your role there, and what's been going on.
Sure. So Think Company is an experience design firm. We help build websites and digital experiences from UX, content strategy, all the way up through visual design and web development. My role there is to help build out the content strategy practice and sort of get it to the level that UX and design have kind of been for years. Content strategy is more of what we call an emerging practice. And so my job is to really think through what does that look like at Think and how can it best serve our clients.
We're here at South by Southwest. What is your presentation here will be about?
So my presentation is a combination of a couple of interests. So I'm Principal Content Strategy at Think Company, but I also do a podcast called the Cognitive Bias Podcast, which is about, wait for it, cognitive bias. My talk is called How to Fight Bias with Content Strategy. So I'm going to look at some biases that can maybe sometimes lead users down the wrong path, and then some content strategy and design approaches that can maybe help get them back on the right path.
So in your podcast and in your speaking opportunities, you've talked about making people's lives actually better through content. Is that still possible with so much content out there, so many marketers churning so much content in the market?
I mean, to me, it isn't so much about the volume of content as to whether or not it's reaching the right audience. Because if you look at it from the audience's point of view, there's only so many hours in the day and only so much content they're actually going to encounter. So if the content you're creating is reaching them, it kind of doesn't matter how many other pieces of content. The waste comes from, oh, I'm producing all of this content and I haven't even thought for a second about who is it for, why am I making it, and am I putting it in the right channels to actually reach the people who need it.
So in your podcast, you've talked about evidence-based design and strategy. Tell us a little bit about that and how that applies to some of the things that you've been talking about.
Sure. So our ethic at Think is always evidence-based, right? We don't want to build something without checking first to see if it's actually needed, right? So we always start out by talking to the users, whether it's employees or customers, who's going to use this thing we're trying to make, what are their needs, what are the things that they're trying to accomplish, and how can user experience help with that? So when we say evidence-based design, that's what we're talking about, is have we actually talked to anyone first before we design something for them?
So is there a lot of A/B testing involved in that? How are you getting to the core of some of the issues there?
So a lot of it is just literally talking to people. So we like to do interviews, so a lot of qualitative one-on-ones with people, but we also will do surveys to get that more quantitative, like larger scope picture of what people's needs are.
What are some of the trends in content that you're seeing?
I think we're definitely seeing a focus on kind of, micro content and a focus on like really getting down to what is this particular individual trying to do in this particular product flow or this particular buy flow, and how can we help them out? As always, personalization is a big thing. I think we're trying to get smarter about it and trying to rely less on almost AI guesses at what the user wants and really working off of more explicit signals of they have signed up for this. They have literally shown an interest in this or that. Let's deliver them that, because that's a much better guess as to what they need than, well, they live here and they're this old and they're in this demographic. Netflix, for example, famously has just done away with demographics. All they care about is, what did you watch? Did you watch it to the end? Okay, I'm going to base my guesses on that, on what you actually did, not did you give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or how old are you, or where do you live? They really don't care about that because their business model is based on, you need to watch stuff. Did you watch stuff?
You actually touched on a good point there. In the age of Netflix, Spotify, Amazon, et cetera, where they're doing somewhat predictive personalization, how do you see that science shaping up over the next 5 years?
I think I would like to say over time we'll pretty quickly get to figuring out what is snake oil and what is sort of like actually useful. But my background in sort of advertising, I used to work for a trade publication, and our advertisers would want to know about like the click-throughs and like the, all these metrics that at the end of the day were not proven to actually sell their product. And yet they kept asking for it. So historically, even once it's clear what personalization approaches work and which ones are just snake oil, we're probably going to still see a lag of maybe even 10 years before people catch on and realize, I shouldn't have been asking for that data. I should have been asking for that data. So I think we will start to figure out the wheat from the chaff, but it's going to take longer than I think most of us expect.
Do you think data science is ahead of the curve when it comes to that? Because with so much data, it just could be something that we're not looking for, like you said.
Well, I think that's the thing, right? Like I talk to a lot of people who work in AI and data science, and the thing it keeps coming back to is what are you actually trying to learn, right? What questions are you trying to answer? Because we can get all the data you want, but at the end of the day, it's just a bunch of data. I have to have something to look for, some question I'm trying to answer, some question my user is trying to answer, to then know what to look for in the data, or even know what data to gather. To go back to that notion of waste, it's like we can spend a lot of time gathering all the data in the world, but if I know at the beginning, oh, I need to know this particular behavior and this particular need, okay, well then I can actually build the technology to just look for that.
You've talked about red team, blue team, and judging some content. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So one of the things that one of the biases that you can run into is confirmation bias. It's one of the most popular and well-known bias. And the basic idea is that once you get an idea in your head or a solution in your head that you like, or that your client likes, or that your boss likes, that's it. Like any other evidence that comes up, you'll dismiss it if it doesn't confirm that thing, or you'll just look for evidence to confirm what you believe. And that can be dangerous because you can leave really good solutions on the table just because you haven't kept digging. Now, it can be expensive to say, okay, let's constantly check our work and let's constantly second guess ourselves. But red team, blue team is an approach that both the military and journalists use, and how many times does that happen? Where you have one team, the blue team, that comes up with the product idea and maybe even gets up to prototyping phase, right? But before they take another step, the red team comes in for one day, and their job is to go to war with the blue team and look for all the hidden little misses, all the little things that could go wrong, or all the different ways that product could actually cause harm that the blue team didn't notice because they were so fixated on that idea for so long. So at relatively low cost, right? I'm not spinning up 2 teams for 6 months. It's no, I need one extra team for one day to come in and just check and make sure we haven't missed anything, and then they can go back to doing whatever they were doing.
And what are some examples where that's worked with some of your clients?
I'll be honest, I haven't used that yet. I actually heard about that, and I'll tell you where that came from. I'm anxious to start using it, but where I heard about it was someone I know who works on the British National Lottery. The British Lottery uses their funds to help out tech for good projects, and this particular person was noticing that some of those projects, when they were actually released into the wild, could potentially have dangerous results. And so he was looking for a way to kind of check before they started giving out those funds that this was actually a good project. And that's when they brought in red team, blue team. And one in particular I think they were looking at was a product that was going to help sex workers report dangerous customers. And they found out that the screen was really bright. And if you're trying to report something and you're hiding in a dark corner, that's a life-threatening situation that if you don't catch that in time, right, without the red team, you don't catch that and potentially something bad happens. So that's where I've seen it in the wild, but I'm anxious to start using it with our clients.
What are some of the concepts that your clients are excited about that you've been working with them on lately?
Sure. Well, you hear a lot about digital transformation, and you'll hear a lot about that here as well. A lot of that really just comes down to change management and sort of the human factors involved, right? And my experience has been, and again, this kind of goes back to the bias thing, the most difficult thing to work around when you're trying to actually build something new in your company isn't so much the technology. The technologies that you need to get the job done aren't crazy, no way science fiction technologies. They're pretty common. The trick is the processes that you need to change to make those technologies work, right? So if I'm going to build a better workflow for content, all of a sudden people need to change the way that they've been creating content, right? They might have been sending you their product descriptions as Word documents, right? And all sorts of different formats. And all of a sudden you have to go back and say, well, actually we're going to use structured content now, so I need you to fill out just these pieces of content, and maybe a lot of the marketing stuff that we found your customers don't care about, maybe don't write that anymore. And even if the process you're describing at the end of the day is more efficient and might even make your job more enjoyable, there's a lot of status quo bias where it's like, well, I've always done it this way. Like, why are you telling me it can be scary and people can get angry, right? Like, why are you changing the way we do things here? That actually, I think, is usually the biggest challenge when you're trying to go through what we call digital transformation. It's more the human side of that that's really challenging.
Let's take a step back into your background and what led you into content strategy. How did you develop that passion for it? And I can see just in your speaking that you're excited about it.
Oh, absolutely. So my background, my deep background is in filmmaking. I've been making movies ever since I was in high school. So that content storytelling part of me comes from there. But around 2000, I started getting involved in distance education, teaching really, really smart junior high and high school kids how to take college level courses online. And that's kind of when I fell in love with the web. So the world of storytelling and the world of, digital have kind of been converging ever since then. And so over time, I started getting jobs like online editor-in-chief at like a trade publication magazine, which it wasn't called content strategy, but I was making very key strategic decisions about content and how to structure it and what to put on the web and what not to. That in any other day would have been called content strategy. And eventually I found my way from there to working in kind of the experience design firm world of literally my business card says content strategist. But I've been working with structuring and coming up with cool ideas for content for like a decade now.
How are brands engaging in content strategy to support their overall brand message and perhaps even the user experience?
The intersection between brand and user experience is really interesting. And oftentimes we do have, like, in our larger projects, a line of work around brand and around sort of style guides and things like that. While at the same time, we're also trying to find out, okay, well, what is it that your user needs? And so we can find situations where part of it is trying to understand who the client wants to be to the user. And part of that is simple things like, okay, what task are you trying to help them accomplish? Is it, generating a lead? Is it finding out more information about your company or something like that? And then at the same time, making sure that both the brand, right, the messaging, the voice, the tone, the way that you're talking about yourself matches that, right? But also that your tasks aren't sort of, if you say that you're sort of a client or a consumer-friendly company, when I try to do stuff on your website, is it actually consumer friendly? It's making sure that that story keeps going, not just through the messaging and the colors you're using, but actually through, okay, when I try to do this on your site, is it easy? You say it's easy to use your products. Is it easy to use your website? Like, that all needs to flow together. So that's where that intersection, I think, comes in.
As a filmmaker and a podcaster, are there any disruptive technologies that you see coming down within the next 5 to 10 years? We talked a little bit about AI and data science. Are there any others that particularly affect content strategy?
Not so much, to be honest. I mean, I feel like content strategists themselves are starting to get better tools, but the real disruption I'm seeing now in that sort of design tech world, and you're seeing it at a lot of the talks that are happening here at South by this year, is around things like gender and ethnicity and sort of like inclusion. That, I mean, it's a little cliche to say, but like the hot new technology is diversity. The hot new technology is how can we incorporate more voices whose voices haven't been there before. That's now having a bigger impact on kind of the stories we tell and kind of the products we're creating than, oh, now we have AI or, oh, now we have machine learning. You're seeing bigger disruptions now on the human side of, well, who's actually building these things? And when we change who's building them, we're seeing these amazing leaps and bounds in terms of what kinds of even markets that technology is reaching. There's all these great markets out there that nobody knows about. I mean, it's a weird example, but hair products, right? Hair products are a huge business in sort of the African-American side of the world that people who were sort of tech entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley didn't even think about, but you sit them down at a table together and realize, oh, there's a huge market there that no one's really thinking about. So I think that side of it is where we're going to see a lot of the innovation come from, as opposed to purely like we have a new digital product.
So the innovation appears to be more conceptual about these higher level concepts, discussion topics and so forth, and changing the storyteller perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, to give you an example, Black Panther comes out last year, around this time, goes on to become the third highest grossing film ever. And the actual story, right, isn't super different from the Marvel story, a superhero origin story, but because the characters telling that story, the point of view of that story is completely different and is coming from a point of view that we haven't seen in cinema before, it becomes a phenomenon because it's familiar in that it's a superhero trope, but it's totally new because the perspective is totally new. So I think we're seeing that a lot. We're seeing that. I mean, I think tonight, Jordan Peele's new horror film is premiering at South by. And again, horror tropes he's working in aren't new, but the perspective is totally new. And so who's telling the story now, I think, is where we're going to see a lot of the innovation.
So in many ways, the content can stay the same. It's just that who's telling it and perhaps the spin that they're putting on it.
Yeah, exactly. That the perspective you get when someone who doesn't get to hold the camera suddenly gets to hold the camera or, do the coding, right, is innovative, because at the end of the day, that's where technology comes from. It comes from people. And if the same people are making the same technology for years and years and years, you're not really going to see anything new. But if someone else suddenly gets a hold of that computer, I think you're going to see some fresh starts.
My guest today has been David Dillon Thomas, Principal Content Strategy at Think Company. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.